Are we going to begin? It's all good? This is on? I turned this on? The mic? Yeah, because then that would be a big fail. Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So this is a very important topic, and I'm really happy that I have an opportunity to address it. Before I jump into the topic, I want to make two introductory remarks. The first remark I want to make is about the nature or the importance of Islamic law for Muslims and for the type of, if we think of professional positions that people take once they study Islam formally. There's no doubt that Islamic law and the jobs and the professions related to Islamic law take the lion's share of those jobs. Partly that's because Islam places such a importance on praxis, and we have a lot of issues related to what we do in this situation, what we do in that situation, so it's very normal that we would need experts that talk about how do you deal with this and how do you adjudicate cases and so on and so forth. So that's kind of normal, I think, in any community, any society. It's definitely part of our tradition. So from a quantity point of view, there is no doubt that muftis, qadis, fuqaha, jurists, all of those type of positions are the most frequent throughout Islamic history, the most well-paid, the most famous. Institutions are around them, there's no doubt about that. However, that could make one conclude that the job of the faqih is more important than some of the other professions, and I think that would be a mistake. So there are other disciplines, there are other specialties, there are other sciences that are important, very important for the community. It's not just this. I mean, that's the topic that we're going to talk about, but I just wanted to say that from the outset. But yes, when you look at the history of Islamic societies, institutes of learning, these were the premier positions, the positions that come from one studying of fiqh. Okay, the second introductory point I want to make is that you really have to have a calling to be able to do this. If you don't have a calling, it's going to be very difficult to sustain yourself through a very long period of study, because there's going to be a long journey of studying, of discovery, training and perfection of the craft. That takes a long time. What I'm about to share with you will take a long time, and therefore you need to have a calling for that. It's not enough just to be patient. It's not just patience. You really have to feel like that's what you should be doing, because you will find yourself in a mode where you are literally spending every waking moment related to this topic. And if you don't have a calling for it, it's just not going to work. You won't be very good at it. And I think that you could say that for any type of advanced study. Okay, there are 6 points that I want to bring up to how you become an expert in fiqh. Do I need to raise this or something? I kind of fell, right? Okay. There are 6 points that I want to discuss that not only are how you study and become an expert in fiqh, but this is how you'll become an expert in any of the Islamic disciplines. So there's about a dozen of Islamic disciplines that we have. So whether we're talking about fiqh or hadith or tafsir or the Arabic language or tasawwuf or philosophy or aqeedah, whatever we're talking about, the 6 type of categories I'm going to go through are the same. And then I will give the general term, and then I will give the specific term as it relates to Islamic law. So one of the reasons why this lecture is important is that it gives us an opportunity to kind of have a mental map of how you become an expert in the Islamic sciences, not just fiqh, but all of the Islamic sciences. The first thing is to study the usul of any science, the theory of any science, the theory of any discipline. So when it comes to Islamic law, what we mean by that is usul al-fiqh. So usul al-fiqh is an essential component. From a theoretical point of view, it is the first thing that you would study, because it's the theory from which comes the law. And in usul al-fiqh, we have 2 or 3 approaches to usul al-fiqh. We have the approach of the Hanafi madhab, which we call the approach of the fuqaha. And then we have the approach of the Shafi'is, the Malikis, and the Hanbalis, which we call the approach of the Mutakallimin. And then we have the Mu'tazilites. And those 3 schools are the early schools of usul al-fiqh that wrote extensively in the subject of usul al-fiqh. And each of those madhahib, or each of those approaches, has their own books, a genealogy of books, the big books, and then the summaries and the summaries and the summaries, till you get to sort of, you know, the introductory books that you would study. That's sort of the early approach to usul al-fiqh. However, in like the 700s and 800s of the Islamic calendar, there was an approach to reconcile the schools. And one of the major books that seeks to reconcile those approaches is Jam' al-Jawama by Subki, rahimahullah. And then from Jam' al-Jawama we have derivative books, summaries of those books, etc. So when you study usul al-fiqh, you're going to study that and then work backwards. You're not going to study like, oh, I'm going to pick a Mu'tazilite book of usul al-fiqh or a Hanafi book of, you're not going to do that. You're going to study the reconciled school that represents the sort of the bringing together of these streams. And then once you start to get a handle of usul al-fiqh, you will start to work backwards and backwards and backwards until you get to the older books, until you get to the level of specialty that I want to specialize in this or specialize in that. Now, in the subject of usul al-fiqh, we have 3 broad topics that we are discussing. The first topic is that we are discussing what are the sources of our religion. The Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, those are the agreed upon sources of our religion. And of course there are sources that are not necessarily, other things that are not agreed upon by the fuqaha. And then we study the tools of interpretation of those sources. So what tools do you need, whether they're linguistic tools, logical tools, what tools of interpretation do you need to interpret the sources of religion? And then the third topic is, what are the condition of the person who is going to do that research? That person we label the mujtahid. Those are the 3 categories, or the 3 broad subjects that we study in usul al-fiqh. Now those 3 parts, the sources of our religion, the tools of interpreting the sources of our religion, and the conditions of the researcher, those then become borrowed by Europeans in the medieval period, and this is what forms what later is articulated as the scientific method. So Roger Bacon and those type of thinkers, they took this idea of experimenting and the condition of the research, so on and so forth, they took that from the scholars of usul al-fiqh. So the first area to become an expert in Islamic law is you have to study the usul of Islamic law, the way that I'm explaining it to you. You have to understand that there are different strands, there are different approaches. You have to know what the books are of those approaches, what order are those books, what are the summaries of those books, how they come together. Now we have the reconciled school, so we're going to study the later books, and then we're going to work backwards slowly, 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 until you get to a level of expertise that you sort of, you know where you need to go for this or for that. The second discipline that you need to master is you need to master the furu'a, the branches of that theory. Not just in Islamic law, but in any science that we're talking about. So in Islamic law, that's what we study. We study the furu'a. Now, even though the branches theoretically come second, usually when you study Islamic law, this is what you start with. Because the theory, the usul, can be a little too abstract. So when you start with the furu'a, when you study the furu'a, you are looking at the application of usul al-fiqh to the Quran and the Sunnah, to the primary sources, and how the fuqaha before us derived laws. The result of that exercise, that's what we mean is, that's what furu'a is, that's what the branches are. So when you study a book of Islamic law for any madhab, that's a snapshot of the applied theory to the Quran and Sunnah as it relates to praxis, our af'al, our actions, and the results of that, given a particular madhab's approach. Now, when you study furu'a, when you study the branches, you have to study one madhab at a time. And each madhab of Islamic law, whether they be the Sunni madhabs or the non-Sunni madhabs or the Shia madhab, any madhab of Islamic law has, it's all same thing, the genealogy of its books. So you need to know the madhab that you're studying, where are the books and what's the mental map of the books, what's the first book, quote unquote. And then there will be a path of study from introductory, intermediate, advanced. And that's the order that you need to go in. Usually the introductory books are the latter books, usually, not always. And again, like Usul al-Fiqh, you work backwards to the more advanced books. Now, when you study Islamic law, when you study a madhab, eventually at some point you can't really study the madhab unless you are also learning about the other madhahib. So even though I'm saying you're going to study one madhab at a time, by the time you get to the intermediate level, you're already going to be hitting up against other opinions. Because the way the madhab expresses itself and explains how it decided that this is the correct interpretation of this hadith or this verse, is it will explain itself in contrast to the other school. So in the Shafi'i madhab we do 1, 2, 3 in opposition to what the Hanafis say 4, 5, 6. So then you learn, oh okay, the Hanafis look at this different, 4, 5, 6. So that's very, very common. And when you get to the advanced level, it's almost like a direct debate. The madhab are directly debating, and the advanced book of your madhab is establishing why we think we are right and the other madhab is wrong. But to do that, you have to articulate what the other madhab says. So even though I'm saying you're going to start with one madhab, you're going to end up learning about the other ones more or less, but not entirely. So one of the things that you don't learn about is you won't necessarily learn about the non-Sunni madhabs. So that's missing. And you certainly won't hear about the Shia madhabs. But you will hear about the 4 Sunni madhabs. Maybe occasionally there'll be a reference to this mujtahid or that mujtahid. So when we talk about furu', we're going to study one madhab at a time. We're going to learn what the major books of that madhab are. Then we're going to go beginning, intermediate, advanced. The goal is to get to the advanced level. We know that as we go through the list of books and the course of study, we know that we will learn about other madhahib, but we also know that we have some blind spots. The blind spots are we won't know about the other non-Sunni madhab. What's a non-Sunni madhab? It's a madhab that didn't make it through time or wasn't codified, like the madhab of al-Awza'i or the madhab of Layth radiyallahu anhu, for example. So these were mujtahids. Imam al-Shafi'i, he said that Layth, when he came to Egypt, he missed Layth, he saw his students. And from what he saw from Imam Layth's students, he said, Laythu afqah min Malik. Layth is more of a jurist than Malik, but Layth's students caused his madhab to be lost, whereas Malik's students didn't. So for a madhab to survive, you need students. And the students take the usul of their imam, they codify it, they write it, they do the furu'a and they teach it, and so on and so on and so forth. But if there's an imam that doesn't have enough students, or like Imam al-Awza'i, there were all of these natural disasters in the Levant, and a lot of his books were lost and burned, then the madhab doesn't make it. That doesn't mean that there's not treasures in that madhab. So alhamdulillah, we have a huge plethora of writings that catalog a lot of these opinions. So when I say you need to learn furu'a, you also got to put in the sweat equity, and you got to find out where those opinions are. And you got to learn about the non-Sunni madhabs. And if you really want to be thorough, you're going to also have to learn about the Shia madhabs, the Zaydis in Yemen and the Ithna Ashariyya, the Jafari madhab. And then that way you can say, okay, I really have a comprehensive idea. Of course, you can't do this for every single point of law, but you have to be able at least to know where to go for the furu'a discussion. How do this madhab solve this problem? Is there a non-Sunni opinion that solves this particular problem? Because the Sunni madhabs, it's not working for us. Like the jamarat in the Hajj, all of the madhabs say you can only do the jamarat after dhuhr prayer. But there's a non-Sunni madhab from one of the tabi'een who said no, it's 24 hours. And that's the opinion that we follow today. So sometimes when there's a crisis or there's a big problem, you will find a solution in the huge canon of Islamic law that we have. So it's not enough just to study your madhab. It's not enough to study at even an advanced level just of your madhab. You have to learn where you can look up books, where you can look up issues of the other madhab in their books, Sunni madhabs, non-Sunni madhabs, Shia madhabs. Now, when I'm talking about the course of study for usul al-fiqh and furu'a, these 2 points that we're still discussing, it's important that you study with somebody or in a seminary or in a system of learning to the point where you can get the key of understanding. So the goal is not to do everything that I just said with a teacher. That's impossible. It'll take forever. Your goal of studying is to get to a point where you understand the keys of that discipline. So you study usul al-fiqh until you, oh, that's what it's about. I got it. I got the keys now. And then I can go on and I can do the rest on my own. Same thing with fiqh. These long books, the advanced books of a madhab, you rarely read those books with a teacher. Because by the time you get to the intermediate level, you already know how to read the books. So the goal is to learn how to read, to learn how to study, to learn the keys of each discipline. And what I'm saying applies to Islamic law and all other disciplines. Okay, so the first thing we said is usul, the theory. Number 2 is the branches of that theory, the furu'a. And then number 3 is the practical applications of that discipline, at-tatbiqat. In the study of Islamic law, what is the practical application? We call this fatawa. So you have to study the fatwa literature, which is an ocean amongst other oceans. I mean, it's a huge, huge, huge area. The fatwa is to look at the primary source, the Quran and the Sunnah, and then to look at the context of now and apply your understanding of the primary with the same type of rigor of everything else that I just said. Because to be able to give a ruling on something, you have to first conceptualize it. You can't conceptualize it unless you understand the context. So this is in itself, the fatwa process is its own training. It has a special process to train a mufti to do this. Whereas the usul and the furu'a are more of a theoretical nature, the fatwa is a real snapshot in time because it shows how a particular mujtahid will apply their understanding now, in whatever their now was. So whenever I teach my students, I tell them there's a difference between theoretical fiqh and applied fiqh. This is what I mean. Theoretical fiqh is we're going to study the books, the way that we receive them, we're going to transmit to you all of the traditional opinions and all of the traditional points that we have. But when it comes to practical application, that's a different matter. Because some things that we study theoretically are not applicable today, or weren't applicable yesterday, or might not be applicable tomorrow, so on and so forth. So you cannot really master Islamic law unless you master this subject as well, which is to understand the practical applications of the discipline, which we call in the science of Islamic law, the fatwa. And there are, alhamdulillah, many collections of fatwa. Almost everyone has a collection of fatwa. That was a major Islamic jurist, whether it be a small collection or a vast collection. And there are some collections that are more famous than others. Al-Fatawa al-Hindiyya is a very famous collection of Hanafi fatawa. The Fatawa of al-Wanshirisi was one of the last great jurists of Al-Andalusia as Muslims were being, Muslim Spain was collapsing. He has 19-20 volumes of fatawa. Ibn Rushd has a fatwa, Al-Ghazali has a fatwa, Nawawi has a fatwa, so on and so forth. And then now, many Muslim majority countries have fatwa offices, and they are also now publishing and organizing the history of their fatwa. So that's also another resource, is that you can go to a Muslim majority country and see where their ifta office is, or what serves that function. And at least online there'll be a digital copy of their collections of fatwa. So you have to learn where those things are, and you have to be able to learn how to read the fatwa. Because the fatwa will look at the primary source, look at the context, and try to link them together. Number four is you have to know the biographies of the main players of your field. And this is what we call a tabaqat literature. So every field, every science, every madhab has their own tabaqat. Who's who? Each madhab has its own tabaqat literature. The Shafi'is, we have a tabaqat, the Hanafis, the Hanbalis, the Malikis, so on and so forth. So you need to be able to know, first of all, what those books are, and you need to know in your madhab who are the main players, because in your madhab you have special terms. Like, who is al-Qadi in your madhab? There's a guy, but we call him al-Qadi. Who is Shaykh al-Islam? There's a specific person called that. So if you don't study the tabaqat literature, you're not going to know what those, when you come across those names in your madhab's literature, you're not going to know. And to make things more confusing, each madhab has its own lists, own names, so you have to kind of know what those things are. Another approach to the tabaqat literature is we have histories of different regions in Islam. So like the history of Damascus, the history of Nisapur, the history of Baghdad, the history of Sham, etc. These books also are very, very important, because they will have biographies of major figures. Another approach is that there will be books in which there are histories of the qadis, of the chief justices of a particular city, or a particular town, or a particular region. Those are also very important, because you can read their biographies and understand how they lived and what they did. So the tabaqat, you need to know who are the major people in your subject, what their titles were, what they did, so on and so forth. Number 5 is you need to keep up with what's happening in the contemporary discussion in your field. So the Islamic sciences, alhamdulillah, are alive, and there are many people that are working with them and advancing them and writing about them and discussing them. So you need to find out who are the major people. In this case, we're discussing Islamic law. Who are the major jurists of today? Where are they gathering? What are they discussing? There are fiqh councils, major fiqh councils around the world. Some of them are, and they have different flavors. They're not all the same. You might agree with some of them, you might disagree with some of them, but you at least need to know what's going on. You need to know that there's a fiqh council in Jeddah, and the OIC that's attached to the OIC. You need to know these things. And now, because things are digital, you can almost access most of these things online. And they have gatherings and they have decisions on hot topic issues that we're all facing, or we might be facing. So it's important to keep up with the contemporary discussion, like as you would in any other field. But if you think that Islamic law is just something in the past and that's it, then you're missing the whole point. This is a living thing. So we need to, if you want to be an expert in Islamic law, you need to understand where are these gatherings. If you can be part of the gatherings, that would be great. But at least, second best is unique, because sometimes trying to access them is a little bit difficult. You at least need to know and try to access their digital publications and see what's being written. You would be surprised, very surprised, that there are many, many current issues that have been discussed already. But Western Muslims are completely, geographically and from a thought point of view, quite far away from what's happening. There's a lot of fiqh that's happening in the subcontinent, for example. People like Mufti Taqi al-Uthmani and his students. I mean, doesn't mean that you have to agree with everyone's approach, but these are the people that are dealing with Islamic law now. These are the people that are writing and rewriting constitutions of countries and helping laws being enacted in Muslim majority countries. This is huge stuff. This shows the importance of Islamic law and what's happening. So if you want to be an expert in Islamic law, you have to understand what your colleagues are doing in their writing. You might not agree with all of them, and that's fine, but you have to understand that so-and-so is doing this approach. Iran is another total area where it's like, you know, like a black box for many people, but it's an Islamic state, and they have, obviously we know, the ulama all over the place running things, and they have their version and interpretation of Islamic law. So they have interesting things. And I'd be in many conversations with Shia people in my masjid, and then they'll send me like a fatwa by a Sistani on a certain topic. So I have to look at it and say, okay, what did he say about this topic? Oh, that's interesting. Is there something from the Sunni world? So you have to be able to understand what these things are, because they're current. So a lot of the Shia Maraja, they have websites, and in Iran I think there are some centers or state something, or I can't remember the name of it right now, but they have some kind of mechanism or some body in which they review laws to see if they're compatible or incompatible with the Sharia. I can't remember what it's called. And many Muslim majority countries have that, by the way. And that's where you'll find a lot of discussion. In Egypt, we have something called Al-Mahkama Al-Dusturiyya Al-Ulya, the High Constitutional Court, like the equivalent of the Supreme Court. So I got their journals. I mean, the legal discussions there is unbelievable. I mean, they're not necessarily fuqaha, Islamic jurists, but one of the jobs of this constitutional court is to review any law that's petitioned to the court that is claimed to be against Islamic law, because we can't have a law in Egypt that's against Islamic law overtly. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. I mean, this is really boring reading, I understand, but I mean, if you want to be an expert in Islamic law, you got to know where these things are. You got to know about these things. You have to be able to access them, because that's where the discussion is happening. So these last 5 things, let me just review where we are. We talked about studying the usul of a subject, studying the furu'a of a subject, studying the practical applications of your field, studying the biographies of the main players, and number 5 is studying and learning about what's happening in the contemporary discussion. Okay? These 5 apply for any Islamic subject. Any Islamic subject. If you want to learn hadith, there's the theory of hadith, there are the books of the collections of hadith, there are the practical applications, which is the naqd, the criticism of the hadith. There's the biographies of the muhaddithun, and then there are the modern hadith scholars that are doing critical editions of this and that and the other thing. You can do this, what I just said, for any of the subjects. So I want you to start to think of the Islamic subjects in this way. What is the theory of the subject? What are the branches of the subject? What are the practical applications of the subject? Like people that want to study grammar, or the Islamic or the Arabic sciences. What's the practical application of Arabic? I'rab al-Quran. They have many copies of the Quran in which there's the whole I'rab of the Quran. That shows you that that grammarian's understanding of what is being said grammatically in the Quran. They're not all the same. There are differences of opinion. So I want you to think of all of these things. And I want to add a sixth piece of advice that is essential, not just for Islamic law, but also for all Islamic disciplines, which is your own personal spiritual discipline. Any major book of usul al-fiqh concludes with a chapter on tasawwuf, not a chapter of ijtihad. Because the mujtahid, the person who is supposed to be capable of doing the research, the person who's going to take the tools and go to the Quran and Sunnah and derive, has to be a master of the self as well as the master of the subject. You cannot do what I just said at an optimal level, at an alpha level, if you are not a master of the self. And that is why the spiritual discipline is the most important discipline of all of the Islamic disciplines. The saints that Islam has produced, these are the luminary figure, the true inheritors of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you do not couple with your academic approach a seriousness of the spiritual approach, you will not reach the goal of this, what we're talking about, this level of expertise. There will always be something lacking. You will be harsh with people, for example. You won't be flexible with people. You won't really want to understand people. You'll be very, it's this way and no way. And that's not how the mujtahid is. The mujtahids of this ummah were the saints of this ummah. And if you read my recent book, Gate to Medina, I have a couple of chapters just on this topic to show you the link between ijtihad and tasawwuf, how they're, two sides to the same coin. But I've seen many people that are in the Islamic legal sphere, and there's a harshness, a harshness in how they talk to people. But that's not the inheritance of the Prophet. The Prophet wasn't, he was not lewd, he was not harsh, he was forgiving, and he was merciful, and he was loving, and he was easy with people, and he made people laugh, and he made people feel good about themselves. And if you are if you are a quote-unquote expert of Islamic law is nothing other than what the Prophet ﷺ taught us how to act. So you have to bring that spirit into what you're doing, or else you'll miss the whole thing altogether. You'll get just lost in all of the details of the law. And that's not good. You're not really going to guide people. So it's very, very, very important to have a strong spiritual tradition, a strong spiritual discipline where you are trying to master yourself. Now, when you do all of this, what is the expert of Islamic law called? He or she is called faqihun nafs, the jurist of the self, which means that they have arrived at a level of familiarity with Islamic law so much that Islamic law is part of their being, that they are eating, breathing, thinking Islamic law. They can't be but Islamic law. That level of expertise doesn't happen if you don't have a spiritual discipline. Everything that I said up until this last point, you can learn, you can train, you can read, you can study. Yeah, okay, you can attend conferences and read report. You can do all of that stuff. But if you don't rectify what's here, then you're not going to make that part of you. That's when you really unlock, this latent power that you have inside you, to the point that you are fiqh, you are usul, you are that topic, and it's enmeshed in your own being, your blood and your nerves and your whole. You are that subject. The best way I explain this to people, I know I'm going to give you an example. It's going to seem sacrilegious, but it's a monologue, so I guess I could say whatever I want right now, up until right now. But I think of somebody like Taylor Swift, who is, she can't be except what she is. She's been strumming that guitar since she was a teenager, or even before. And the lyrics just come, and the song just come, and she is an expert of that. She is that. It's a part of her. You can't think, it's not like she tried to do this and, it didn't work out, so I'm going to go back doing this. She was born to do this. And if you find an artist or a musician or a peak athlete that's like that, they were born to do that. That's what I'm talking, that's what al-faqih an-nafs is. They were born to be a faqih. But that does not come except with mastering those 5 things that I just mentioned to you, the usul and the furu'a and the practical applications and the biographies and the modern conversation. That study has to be coupled with very deep, genuine spiritual discipline. Deep, work on one's nafs. And to understand that you have to have a spiritual, emotional, psychological relationship with the Quran and the Sunnah. Only then can you really be a true expert. Because you're not just communicating the letter of the law, you are communicating the spirit of the law as well. So this is my advice for not only being an expert of Islamic law, but this is my advice as well for being an expert indeed in all of the Islamic subjects. I'll pause here to see if people have any questions, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Yes?
One thing, I'm not faqih or mujtahid, I'm very ignorant. The 2 things which you said I don't agree is study non-Sunni. In the first place, I have to follow Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, his method, his what I believe in Islam is I have to do what he did, and I have to follow his sabil. So you say study non-Sunni. So why should I study in the first place? I have my own Sunni, Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam. One, I don't agree with that. The second, Fiqh. Fiqh is always the same. Fiqh, Islam is Islam. No matter what, during Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam time or now at 25, is our deen is the same. Why you said sometimes it is not practical or sometimes fiqh goes with time. These two things I really don't really agree, even though I'm ignorant that my ability, my way of follow Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, I'm just really against what these 2 points.
So, when we look at a hadith or we look at a verse of the Quran, each verse and hadith that tells us to do something, al-af'al, this is what fiqh deals with. It deals with what we do. Each of those verses have embedded in them multiple ways of understanding them. There's not just one understanding, because that's not what a lugha is. Lugha, any lugha, but especially the lugha of the Arabic language and the Arabic of the Quran, there's not just one way of understanding it. So when the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahaba, لا تصلين العصر إلا عند بني قريظة, do not pray Asr prayer until Bani Qurayza. Okay, it's a simple statement. So they left. But then Asr was ending and Maghrib was coming. So one group of the Sahaba stopped to pray. And the other group said, what are you doing? The Prophet ﷺ said, don't pray Asr until you get to Bani Qurayza. The first group said, no, he meant hurry up. But we have to pray Asr or we're going to miss Maghrib. So one group of the Sahaba prayed Asr. The other group went, missed Asr, got to Bani Qurayza and prayed Asr Qada. When the Prophet ﷺ got to Bani Qurayza, they asked him about what happened, and he said, both of you are correct. So the problem that people, or the issue that people don't keep in mind, is that there are multiple equal meanings to the hadith and the verses of the Quran that tell us what to do. All of the different madhahib, they are just different approaches to understanding the same Quran and Sunnah. There's no difference. There is only one Quran and one Sunnah. But how you understand them, because the language of them, it carries in it multiple meanings. That's one thing. The other thing is, there are, when I say non-Sunni madhabs, I mean non-4 madhabs, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanbali. But all of the 85 madhabs that we have, other than the 2 Sunni madhabs, there are Sunni madhabs as well. I meant non-codified Sunni madhabs. Like the madhab of Al-Awza'i, the madhab of Layth, the madhab of Sufyan, Ibn Mas'ud, so on, radiallahu anhum ajma'in. That's ijtihad. So when the Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh to Yemen, he said, what are you going to do? If you have a question, I'm going to answer from the Quran. What are you going to do if you didn't find it in the Quran? I'll find it in the Sunnah. What will you do if you don't find it in the Sunnah? Ijtahidu ra'i. I will do ijtihad based on my understanding. And the Prophet ﷺ patted him on his chest and he said, Alhamdulillah, Allah has guided His Prophet's messenger to what His messenger wants. So ijtihad is nisbi. It's not foolproof. Ijtihad is an individual's attempt to understand based on the agreed tools. But I could make a mistake when I make my ijtihad. And that's why we have a multiplicity of opinions. So I can't really study Islamic law unless I study everything, including the Shia madhabs, because they have their own understanding. Doesn't mean that I'm a Shia. But they might have an understanding that I don't have. They might have a solution for a particular issue that the Sunni madhabs didn't think of. So that's on that issue. The other issue is that there is a difference between the text, the Quran and the Sunnah. This is wahi. This is revelation. And as wahi, it comes from the realm of the absolute, al-mutlaq. And then we have the here and now. The here and now is not absolute. How do you bring the absolute into the finite? It will express itself differently with time, place, person, and circumstance. We call this al-jihat al-arba', the four directions: time, place, people, and circumstance. The Sahaba acted a certain way in Mecca before the Fath, different than what they did in Medina. There was no Salat al-Jum'ah in Mecca during the Quraysh, before the Fath, but there was Salat al-Jum'ah in Medina. As a matter of fact, the Madanese Muslims prayed Jum'ah before the Prophet ﷺ because he was still in Mecca. So Islamic, the things that Allah has asked us to do and the Prophet ﷺ has asked us to do have differences how they are expressed in time, place, person, and circumstance. It's not always the same. So that's also something that the faqih has to take into consideration. What has happened in the circumstance now that has changed from the past, so when we come to apply the Quran and Sunnah today, we apply it correctly, not incorrectly.
Since you say that there are multiple ways that we can interpret the rulings, so would it be okay to take the literal interpretation like the Salafis do?
Salafi is not a madhab. These are just misguided people. Literal interpretation, yes, we take the literal interpretation of words unless the literal meaning creates a problem. When does the literal meaning create a problem? Like if I go to Allah Ta'ala's sifat in the Quran, Yadullah, the hand of God. Well, I can't take a literal meaning because God doesn't have a hand, because God is without form. Laysa kamithlihi shay'. So in that context, I can't take a literal meaning. It would be haram. I would create a heretical interpretation. But when I have a word, I take the literal meaning as long as I said, the literal meaning doesn't cause some problem in the interpretation. You understand that? Okay. That does not negate that there could be a more deeper meaning. So our approach as Sunni Muslims is that we acknowledge the literal meaning that can lead us also to a deeper meaning. We do not say that the literal meaning is camouflaging the secret inner meaning, and then once we get that, we can dump the literal meaning. That's like what the Batini say. We don't say that. We say no, we have to, whatever the literal injunction is, we follow it. And we interpret words literally unless there is a part that literal interpretation creates some kind of problem. Then therefore we interpret it metaphorically. This is part of usul al-fiqh. You got it? But the Salafis, that's something else. That's just fitna. That's not a madhab, or it's just a fitna. Now.
It's better to find somebody local, because a mufti from Pakistan might not understand what your situation is here, versus because they're not lived or handle the surroundings around them. Is that what?
Well, traditionally muftis are local people. Yes, I mean local or a recognized authority for a region. Yeah. And if somebody is asked a question from another region, they have to make the effort to understand that context, because one of the things that causes a ruling to change is custom.